Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. Many current news stories start out with the words, scientists say. It's an appeal to authority, and the intent is to get you to turn off your brain and believe anything they say. Let's look at a sample of some of those articles. The Weekend Australian, September 5th, 2012. Enjoy snow now. By 2020, it'll be gone. Environmental researchers say the end of Australia's ski culture is in sight, despite Victoria and New South Wales experiencing one of their best snow seasons in almost a decade. In other words, never mind what you see out your window, we know better. We're scientists. Well, they better hurry up with their predictions because they've only got a few more weeks, and people in Australia are going to be skiing at least through mid-October. This recent picture from Australia doesn't look so much like the end of snow. Here's another one from the Sydney Morning Herald from 2008, predicting a permanent drought in southeast Australia. January 4th, 2008. It may be time to stop describing southeastern Australia as gripped with drought and instead accept the extreme dry as permanent, one of the nation's most senior weather experts warned yesterday. Perhaps we should call it our new climate, said the Bureau of Meteorology's head of climate analysis, David Jones. And then 2 years later, Australia was so wet, it was causing global sea level to drop. So did David Jones at BOM learn anything from this? No, he's doing exactly the same thing with the current drought. Climate alarmists seem to be incapable of learning anything from their mistakes. February 12, 2012. Drought may be the new norm for the UK, says Environment Secretary. The UK was flooded a few weeks later. The Independent, Monday, March 20th, 2000. Snowfalls are now just a thing of the past. They quoted David Viner from the Climatic Research Unit as saying, children just aren't going to know what snow is. Well, I got caught in the Robbie Burns night blizzard of 2003 in Cambridge when there were 11,000 cars stuck on the M11 in deep snow. A lot of children were seeing snow that night. It was very cold and was lucky nobody froze to death. Most of these need no explanation, so I'm just going to run through them pretty quick. The Independent, May 2004, why Antarctica will soon be the only place to live. Antarctica is likely to be the world's only habitable continent by the end of the century if global warming remains unchecked. The government's chief scientist, Professor Sir David King, said last week. The Telegraph, October 2008, climate change study predicts refugees fleeing into Antarctica. The Guardian, February 2004, Pentagon tells Bush climate change will destroy us. Britain will be Siberian by the year 2020. Nuclear conflict, mega droughts, famine, and widespread rioting will erupt across the world, all in the next few weeks. New York Times, February 2014, the end of snow. New York Times, December 2006, endless summer. It goes hand in hand with polar bears dying in the Arctic as the sea ice shrinks. Washington Post, March 2012. Could cherry blossoms one day be blooming in winter? That could mean a bloom process that begins in January and a blooming period in February instead of March. Cherry trees blooming in Washington, D.C. in February? What are these people smoking? BBC, December 2007. Arctic summer is ice-free by 2013. In the end, it will just all melt away quite suddenly, Professor Peter Wadhams, Cambridge University. Sierra Club, why Arctic sea ice will vanish in 2013. The Guardian, July 2013. Ice-free Arctic in 2 years heralds methane catastrophe. Scientist. January 1979. Stephen Schneider of the National Center for Atmospheric Research and Robert Chen of MIT predicting 15 to 25-foot rise in sea level. And it will start before the year 2000. May 1st, 1983, because of man-made global warming trend, world sea level over the next several decades could reach heights unprecedented in the history of civilization, says the draft of a major study by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agencies. The seas, which have been relatively stable during the last 6,000 years, could rise anywhere from a few feet to more than 10 feet. Large parts of the Gulf Coast and Florida would be underwater. Well, it's almost 30 years later, and I'm pretty sure Florida is still there. Canberra Times, January 1988. Governments must yield national sovereignty to multilateral authorities able to enforce laws across environmentally invisible frontiers if the greenhouse effect, which threatens the future of whole nations, is to be overcome, the Commonwealth Secretary General said on Tuesday. A Commonwealth expert group set up to look at climate change estimated there was a 90% certainty that sea levels would rise by between 1 and 4 meters by the year 2030. So unless we all immediately adopt global communism, sea level is going to rise like 15 feet in the next 10 years. Canberra Times, September 1988. The Maldives to be completely drowned within 30 years. That would be last year. The Saudis seem to have a different opinion as they're investing $10 billion in the Maldives right now. Guardian 2010. Sometime in the next decade we may pass that tipping point which would put us warmer than temperatures that Greenland can survive. The fallout would be felt thousands of miles away from the Arctic, unleashing a global sea level rise of 23 feet, 7 meters, Alley warned. Wow, 23 feet of sea level rise by the year 2020. That sounds terrible. Washington Post, July 1971. U.S. scientist sees new ice age coming. The world could be as little as 50 or 60 years away from a disastrous new ice age, a leading atmospheric scientist predicts. Dr. S.I. Rasool of NASA and Columbia University says that. 50 years from 1971, that puts us just a year away from a new ice age. Science News, March 1975, the ice age cometh. There it is, there's the glaciers plowing through downtown Manhattan. Time Magazine, June 1974, another ice age. Telltale signs are everywhere. June 30th, 1989, grim forecast. A senior environmental official at the United Nations, Noel Brown, says entire nations could be wiped off the face of the earth by rising sea levels if global warming is not reversed by the year 2000. June 2017, 4 years to save the earth. 2020 is the deadline to avert climate catastrophe, experts claim in chilling commentary. October 6, 1970, Paul Ehrlich of Stanford University. The oceans will be dead as Lake Erie in less than a decade. America will be subject to water rationing by 1974 and food rationing by 1980. March 1977, the Carter administration predicted the world would run out of oil during the first decade of the 21st century. Well, today is President Carter's 95th birthday, and I'm pretty sure he's still using cars. December 1923, Glacier National Park to be ice-free in another 25 years. That would be 1948. Well, apparently that didn't happen because in 1952, scientists predicted that Glacier National Park would be ice-free in 50 years. Well, apparently that didn't happen either because in 2009, scientists predicted that Glacier National Park would be ice-free by the year 2020. Well, that's not going to happen, so now the New York Times is predicting that Glacier National Park will be ice-free by the year 2044. That's almost a century past the original forecast date. This is what Glacier National Park looks like today. They had one of their coldest winters on record last year, and this year winter is starting extremely early. Somehow I don't think National Geographic is going to get their prediction right that it will be ice-free in the next few weeks. Climate is cyclical. Here's a record of droughts and floods in Australia starting back in the year 1789. 1789 drought, 1791 drought, 1797 drought, flood, 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 slight drought, flood, severe drought, flood, flood, slight drought, flood, 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 slight drought, flood, severe drought, flood, 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 slight drought, extreme drought, extreme drought, extreme drought. Climate alarmists have long-term memory issues, and they look at whatever the current weather is and assume that's the trend that's going to go on forever. But the reality is that drought is always followed by flood, and flood is always followed by drought. And the other reality is that some people have a need to get hysterical about everything they see going on around them. Here's an article from 1846 on the change of climate. That great changes have taken place in the climate of Australia, all testimonies satisfactorily prove. The Aborigines say that the climate has undergone this change since white man came into the country. That was more than 170 years ago. Apparently another constant is that white men always get blamed for climate change. And this is my favorite article from 1871, Brisbane Courier, Imaginary Changes of Climate. A plentiful crop of speculation from weather prophets and projectors and half-instructed meteorologists and all the philosophic tribe of Laputa in general, to whom the periodical press now affords such fatal facilities. Every season is sure to be extraordinary. Almost every month one of the driest or wettest or windiest, coldest or hottest ever known. Much observation, which ought to correct a tendency to exaggerate, seems in some minds to have rather a tendency to increase it. So exactly the same story as we see now. Climate change hysteria does seem to be working off the principle of natural selection. The BBC had this article today. Couples rethinking kids because of climate change. In the age of climate crisis, childbearing has become a fraught question for couples around the globe. So let's take a look at the actual globe. The populations of the Middle East and Africa are growing more than 3% per year. So while Europeans and Americans kill themselves off, less neurotic people are going to take over the planet. But to be fair, I did find one accurate prediction in the Babylon Bee. Experts warn that we only have 12 years left until they change the timeline on global warming again. Climate experts have solemnly warned that we only have 12 years left until they change the dates on global warming again. If we don't take action, then in 12 years we'll have to explain why the world hasn't ended and come up with a new number, one UN scientist warned. This is a very serious threat, and we urge everyone to hand control of the economy to the government immediately, for we have no more time left to change the timeline again. The scientific consensus is that roughly 10 to 12 years from now the world will be flooded with new doomsday predictions. This can all be avoided if we overhaul the economy and become socialists, according to non-political, unbiased, science-y type guys. Should we not change our ways, our old predictions will melt, dangerously raising the chance of us having to move the goalposts again, said Al Gore. Do you really want me to write another book, film another movie, and go on another tour in my private jet just because you dingbats couldn't be bothered to alter your lifestyles? I don't think so. Let's all get on board with this 12-year figure, or we'll have to push back the date again. Personally, I think it would be a good idea if some climate experts flee to Antarctica. Richard Feynman said, "Science is the belief in the ignorance of the experts." There can be little doubt that he was absolutely correct, at least when it comes to climate. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time.